some of it goes back to this phrase that we use a lot at O'Reilly, which is create more value than you capture. Generativity is the idea that low barriers to entry, create much more innovation, but also that generosity does.
Welcome to the DesignRush podcast. I'm your host, Kia Johnson. Today's guest is Tim O'Reilly, founder and CEO of O'Reilly Media, the company behind the movements that shaped the modern internet. From coining open source to championing Web 2.0, Tim has spent decades helping innovators shape the future. In episode 108, he explains why generosity is a business strategy, not a virtue signal, how create more value than you capture became a guiding principle for open source and Web 2.0, and what today's AI era can learn from the internet's rise. Listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or watch on YouTube. You have been called the Oracle of Silicon Valley. You are credited with shaping everything from the rise of open source to the very concept of Web 2.0. Looking back, what gave you the instinct to see value in ideas that others were still ignoring?
Well, I had some very early training when I was a teenager from a guy named George Simon. He actually ran an explorer group, which was the older version of the Boy Scouts. And it was actually about nonverbal communication. But what he taught was really shaped by a kind of a now mostly forgotten field called general semantics. There's a few great lines from "The map is not the territory." Alfred Korzybski, who was the guy who was the founder of general semantics, basically was focused on this idea that people get stuck in words and they forget to look at what the words represent. And that many of the problems in our society come from just following the map and not looking around and seeing if the map is correct. So this idea that the map is not the territory, I got some very early training in that when I was a teenager, and it shaped my career. So for example, when I convened the Open Source Summit, it was because I saw that there was something wrong with the map that was being put forth about free software.
Right.
The idea was that it was dependent on a particular license, that it was kind of this rebel movement that was hostile to commercial activity. And when I looked at the actual territory, well, what were the things I was publishing about? I saw that the things that were in the Free Software Foundation canon were, had a lot in common with it, but weren't included. They didn't talk about the World Wide Web, which was put in the public domain. They didn't talk about Berkeley Unix, which is where I first came into the open source field, because it was, Unix was sort of tied into the whole, proprietary AT&T era. And I went, wait, there was this incredible generativity in Unix before Linux. So what was it? And so, I started this quest to sort of think about that. And then in particular, it was also like the internet as a whole. I went, wait, why aren't they talking about the internet? So when I reframed away from their map and said we have to make a new map, I was able to include and see a lot more things. Similarly, when I, kind of kept, thinking about that problem, it led me to Web 2.0. The Open Source Summit was in 1998. It was where we adopted the name. But I started thinking a lot more about, well, if it's not licenses, what does cause this generativity? And I thought, okay, it's network-enabled cooperation. It's what I came to call an architecture of participation. I'd love to come back to that later. And anyway, just thinking about these things, the internet being more central to me, I started thinking, well, what is really changing here? And then I kind of also had this notion that had shaped my thinking all through, which was I came into the industry when the IBM monopoly was breaking down. And it happened through a certain kind of commodification that happened with the personal computer. Basically computer hardware, which had been IBM's monopoly, became a commodity instead, and something else became valuable. And so actually in 1997, the very first talk I gave on open source, the same conference where Eric Raymond gave the Cathedral and the Bazaar, which was really talking about the whole sort of crowdsourced aspect of collaborative development. I gave a talk called Hardware, Software, and Infoware. And it was really about how the web was replicating this transition that we had from the era dominated by IBM to the era dominated by Microsoft. So, and then later I met Clay Christensen, 7 or 8 years later, and he had just written this paper about what he called the law of conservation of attracted profits. And it was when one thing becomes a commodity, something else becomes valuable. And so we had a real meeting of the minds, because that was the story that I told about Web 2.0. It's like, okay, open source software and the open protocols of the internet have basically commodified the software layer. And so now, something else was going to become valuable. And in thinking about that, I came up with, well, it's collective intelligence, big data, and all the things that characterize Google and Amazon. So when I was telling the story about what distinguished the companies that survived the dot-com bust from those that didn't, Web 2.0, I kind of went, oh, okay, it's this pattern. And so all that in some ways comes back to this idea of the map is not the territory, and you have to be open-minded and look at the world afresh. But there's another aspect to that, and that is that you do have to have a kind of meta map. So this idea of this alternating sequence of openness, which leads to eventually the formation of a monopoly, and then that leads to people to go look for openness somewhere else, becomes kind of a meta map that you can see the world through. And so, for example, I have a set of opinions about AI that are shaped by, oh yeah, this is a new iteration of that pattern, and then as a result, such and such step. So, Mark Twain once famously said, or has been attributed to him, history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme.
So why would you say you believe that giving away like high value ideas can actually drive more business growth versus traditional marketing, for example?
Yeah, some of that's just my upbringing. My father, used to borrow money so he could meet his charitable obligations. Quite often. And so I was raised that way, and it just, so in some sense was a natural expression of that. I think about wonderful things, I don't know if it's true for you, but for me, things become part of your personal mental tool chest. And a wonderful encapsulation of this principle for me actually came from the Canadian television production of Anne of Green Gables, a wonderful children's book. When I was about 30, but my daughter was about 10. And we watched it together, and we actually went to Prince Edward Island, and and there's a wonderful section in the film version where Anne's adopted parent Matthew is talking with his sister Marilla, and she says he brings home a girl instead of a boy. She says, "A girl, what use will she be to us?" And he says, kind of in this slow, kind of thoughtful way, he said, "Well, I was thinking maybe we could be of some use to her." And I guess I just saw that, when I looked at open source, I said generosity and generativity. Generativity is the idea that low barriers to entry, create much more innovation, but also that generosity does. I remember when I did my first Pro conference, and Eric Raymond had written another essay about open source, and sort of as it was kind of like a gift culture, which is a style of culture that the Native Americans had, where you gain status by what you give away. And so I went, oh yeah, you got somebody like Larry Wall, the creator of Perl. He also created something called Patch, which was sort of a crucial tool that made it possible for people to share their code without sending around all the code. You could just send around patches. People don't do that anymore because the network is fast enough that you can send around the whole thing. But, the name survives in Apache, the web server, because it was literally Apache server. It was like everybody could contribute. That's how they came up with that name. And so Larry had done all these things that were and I wrote a little piece once for Nature where I contrasted Larry Wall and Bill Gates. And I took off from a statement by Stuart Brand, which is, information wants to be free, but it also wants to be valuable. And I then said, look, okay, so Bill Gates and Larry Wall both had different strategies for how to make their intellectual creations valuable. Bill Gates said, I'm a businessman. I'm going to turn it into a business. Larry went, I'm not a businessman, but I've gotten so much from other people. I'm going to give something back. And that's how he described it to me. Why did he decide to give all this stuff away? And so that was very, that generosity came through to me from open source. Also, Bob Scheifler was who ran the X Consortium, was somebody who kind of, when I was first trying to build on top of the X Windows system documentation, and certain people who were in the free software world was like, wait, why are you doing that? And I was going, I went to Bob and I said, well, how do you feel about it? He says, no, we want you to do that. We made X as a baseline, and we want all these software companies to build better versions of what we put out. And so why wouldn't we want you to build better versions of our documentation as well? And if virtualizing it is what will fund that for you, you should do it. So he basically said, it was just expressing this, and same thing with the people who were running Berkeley Unix. They were really expressing this fundamental attitude of generosity in a way that, for example, the Free Software Foundation didn't emphasize that generous element, which is why I was not as drawn to it. They were much more into, this is our weapon whereby we will take control, right? And I was like, no, generosity is this amazing superpower.
I mean, if you think about it, generosity, translates in a way to this sense of community as well. When it comes to sharing, I just want to touch base on the fact that, open source itself, it's all about, and you're talking so much to it right now, sharing ideas, tools, frameworks to drive innovation and build trust. So how can the businesses then apply that open source thinking to things such as, building trust with the ICP, generating leads? If we were to get stuck in that a little bit, what would you have to say to that? Yeah.
Well, I guess I would just, some of it goes back to this phrase that we use a lot at O'Reilly, which is create more value than you capture. And we coined that phrase, actually, it was a O'Reilly management retreat with my top exec team. And I happened to mention that a couple of internet billionaires, this is 2000 internet billionaires, had said to me that they had started their company with an O'Reilly book. And I laughed and I said, we got $35, they got billions. That seems pretty good to me. It was like we made this, we should be happy that we made this happen. And I think, I can't remember which one of my team members said, we create more value than we capture. And I went, yeah, that's it. Let's use that as a slogan. And it's true. It's like, that's what makes society work. That we create more value than we capture. And if you look at almost everything that's wrong, it comes from people who are trying to take out of the system more than they put in. And so, and I think that, if you think about this from the perspective of marketing, anybody whose marketing message is me, and this comes to something else, somebody else who was profoundly influential on me was a guy named Brian Irwin, who I hired as my first PR person back in 1992 when we had published this book called The Whole Internet User's Guide and Catalog, which was the first, it was one of the first commercial books on the internet. It was the very first book to talk about the World Wide Web. Went on to sell 1 million copies. And Brian had been the director of activism for the Sierra Club. And he came on, he says, wait, we're not going to market the book. We're going to use the book to market the internet. People don't care about our products. They care about, this thing that's happening. And he really was, in many ways, he's sort of one of the unsung inventors of influencer marketing. He went out there and he found all of the people on Usenet news groups who were, who might be interested, and he sent them free copies of the book. We gave copies to every member of Congress. I got invited then to go speak in front of all the congressional staff, and it was also like when we built the very first web portal, JNN, it was originally designed to help promote the internet, because we had this book and people wanted to try it, but they didn't know how. And we basically said, oh, let's make a kiosk in a store where people can try the internet. And then we looked at it and we went, that's not a promotion, that's a product. And so we then set up a group to actually turn it into a product, which we eventually sold to AOL. And even, I'm the person who first came up with advertising on the internet. But the advertising is not what we think of as advertising today. It was actually, we were largely, at that point, we'd started out as a direct mail book publisher, and direct mail advertising in that period of the 80s, you'd have a magazine and there was something called a bingo card in there. Now, those of you who are younger probably don't remember that, but there was basically a little tear-out card that had a set of numbers, might be 100 or 200 numbers, and each one corresponded to an advertisement. And you look through and you'd see an ad in there or an article, and there'd be a bingo card number that would let you follow up. You would basically, it was a prepaid thing. You'd tear it out, you'd circle the 4 or 5 things that interested you, and you'd mail it back, and then you would get a brochure in the mail. And I went, oh my gosh, that we can recreate that kind of advertising on the internet. And it was interesting because at the time the internet was, had this acceptable use policy that said no commercial use. And I thought, well, this is really different. It's like, obviously, if you put up a website and it's a commercial website and people want the information, they're coming to you for it. You're not spamming them. You're not doing it. So anyway, I went and talked to Steve Wolf of the National Science Foundation, who had oversight of this acceptable use policy. And he said, well, we say the internet's for research and education. And if anybody is for that, you are. So go for it. Or did. But that notion, so the notion was really, now we don't think of it as advertising, but it was the very notion of the commercial website that you would put up information that would be valuable to people that they would want to come for, and so, and if you think about how a good website works, it is in fact, like a bad website, is basically tries to trap the user. A good website helps the user. Good marketing content is content that's helpful to users, and they go, wow, yeah, this is a trusted resource. What are the products that are related to this? And so we've always tried to tell stories that help people make sense of their world. Lisa Reichelt, who was one of the early bloggers, had this wonderful phrase. She said, blogging is narrating your work in public. And that's obviously a big part of open source too. It's sharing. And a lot of people think of marketing only as persuasion. And they don't understand that the beginning of persuasion is trust.
I want to chat a little bit about a company like HubSpot, for example. I mean, they created massive impact by open sourcing marketing frameworks through content and education. So how can other brands do something similar, productizing their expertise into scalable open source assets?
Their marketing led with, here's what we've learned and here's how you can use it. And yeah, our product can help you use it, but it wasn't take our product, and then when they will tell you how to get the value out of it. They led with, you can do a lot of the stuff without our product. It'll just be better with our product. It's a much more natural, value for the user led conversation. And again, I guess that goes back to why I think of, open source is this idea of generosity and generativity being the heart of what that means. It's generous in that you're giving somebody value that you might otherwise be trying to monetize, and it's generative in that you're basically creating new ways to enable them to create value for themselves.
What would you say then are the other common pitfalls that you've seen, when companies try to go open,
Well, the biggest one that, and this goes back a long time to when I was having, kind of a lot of my time was spent sort of arguing with the people who thought that open source was about licenses. And this is another, truly influential person in my life. It was a guy. It was Brian Kernighan, who was. He wasn't actually He was. It's funny. He was a critical person in Bell Labs in the development of Unix. And he wrote a book with Rob Pike called the Unix Programming Environment. And actually, if you go look it up on Wikipedia, I wrote the original entry for it because it so encapsulated for me this idea that I later called the architecture of participation. It really was talking about how Unix was designed as a set of small cooperating pieces that could work together. They all followed the same rules. And that sort of is a natural, if you think about that is what distinguished the internet as well. And I called it an architecture of participation. And there's a couple of things that crystallized that for me. One was a conversation with Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux. And he said, I couldn't have made a new kernel for Windows even if I had the source code. He said the architecture just wouldn't support it because it was a big intermixed thing. And then I looked around and I said, well, what are some of the open source projects that are floundering and not having the impact that they might? OpenOffice. It was originally a big, spaghetti ball, and it didn't have that architecture of participation. It was hard to add. Same thing with the GIMP, so this idea that you could just put the magic fairy dust of an open source license on it was not enough. And there were other things that had an architecture of participation, Wikipedia, for example. And people said, oh, well, we'll make wiki-based books. And it didn't work. Why? Because they didn't have an architecture that supported participation. Wikipedia actually has the same kind of small cooperating pieces structure as Unix Linux, or that Apache had when, again, back in the early days of the web, this whole debate. Apache's not adding features as fast as Microsoft Internet, it was called Internet Information Server, or Netscape's, whatever their server was called. They're going to lose. In fact, they won. And why was it? Because they said, no, we're just a web server, but we have this extensibility layer where other people can build on top of what we've done. And that sort of architecture of participation won. And just think about how, open source languages like, it was originally Perl, but now much more Python and JavaScript have become dominant because they have that architecture where, people are writing new JavaScript frameworks that get added on that are easily called Python languages, and that leads me to the current moment with AI. And because I have that fundamental belief in the architecture of participation, I say, okay, the current generation of blitz-scaled AI companies, OpenAI, and all the rest, are not actually going to be the winners. So I didn't know that DeepSeek was going to come along and totally upset the apple cart, but I knew that just by historical analogy, everybody was going, oh my gosh, OpenAI may be the next Google. And I'm going, no, because they look more to me like the next, I haven't made up my mind whether they're the next AOL or the next Netscape. But what they've done is they've taken the old model, which was the culmination of a 20-year process of evolution from a distributed, open, easy to use, easy to join system, i.e. the World Wide Web, into a set of monopolies, and said we can go right to the end from the beginning, or at the beginning. And that's what's wrong with this idea of blitzscaling. It's the idea that you can just buy market share, become dominant. So, and I describe it literally, people like to think of free markets, and what Silicon Valley has become is the equivalent of the Central Committee, with a small number of very deep-pocketed VCs picking winners early on. Now, I believe in what computer scientist Donald Knuth said: premature optimization is the root of all evil. And so, if people are trying to get it, to lock in their market power before the market has actually even figured out what good looks like. And so anyway, so I think that what's happened here, in the same way that the web, this decentralized model, which is where innovation happens when you have a decentralized generative environment, tends to win. And it's this also this idea of this that goes back to my hardware, software, and infoware, and Clay Christensen's law of conservation of attractive profits. The first people who come in and try to win play by the old rules. All the companies after the PC market was taking off were trying to basically win in hardware. Dell did actually do pretty well, but you saw all these companies, HP, they're all like, okay, we'll be the big PC vendor, the big hardware vendor. And then eventually it became more and more of a commodity. You started having clones from Asia, and eventually there was value to be extracted, but it wasn't the real locus. And Microsoft figured out that actually it was in the operating system and applications, which had been devalued before. And so along comes Netscape, and they're like, wow, we will be the Microsoft of the web. We're going to control the server, we're going to control the browser, and that will allow us to make what Mark Andreessen used to talk about, the web top, back in those days. And they were just wrong. The real winners were people who built on top of open source, people like Google, and who built something completely new. And in a lot of ways, there's an interesting analogy when Google released the Transformer paper in 2020, and this what was the first LLM that was open source was BERT. I look at that and I went, oh my God, they've just done what IBM did in 1982 or whenever it was they released the PC. They gave away their secret sauce. They undermined their own monopoly, and because suddenly an LLM encapsulated something that used to be this process that took this huge amount of money constantly crawling the web, and suddenly it gets encapsulated into this artifact. And so anyway, it took a few years for that shoe to drop, but we're now in that world where there's something profoundly new happening. And the monopoly that Google and Amazon got through network effects and all that was, again, it's not just going to go away. I mean, Microsoft's still around as a company, IBM is still around as a company, but there's something new that needs to be born. And it's going to be born out of this new world that I think the DeepSeek is really the trigger for, where everybody can have their own model, where there is an architecture of participation. And I'm writing a piece right now about disclosures and AI. I have this project at the Social Science Research Council called the AI Disclosures Project. The piece is called Disclosures. You keep using that word. It does not. I don't think it means what you think it means. Whatever that line is from The Princess Bride, and because really disclosures are, what I'm really talking about is this architecture of participation idea, and we need an architecture of participation for AI that does not look like railroads, i.e. is controlled by a small number of people. They control all the lines. Okay, so that area, OpenAI, you can use our APIs and you can build on top of it, but you have to pay us. And it's very much what happened back, again, this is why I go back to AOL as an analogy. When we were introducing GNN and the World Wide Web to the world, AOL was saying, we're going to be the way you get online with the internet, and they were trying to attract businesses, and Microsoft had started the Microsoft network, and that was just like AOL. And I remember getting up a PC forum and saying, no, the web, anyone can do this, and suddenly it's okay. So roll forward here 20 years, and this is true of AI. We're now in a world where, openness is making entirely new things possible. And I would bet that over in 20 years, there will be some kind of AI monopoly, but I don't think it's something we're going to get today.
You spoke about creating more value than you capture, right? So What would you say then are the steps that businesses actually need to take to adopt that mindset? I mean, it's a way of thinking, but it's also like, if I'm a business and I want to start shifting the way that we are thinking and getting to that mindset,
Yeah.
How would I start?
I think you start by asking who you create value for. And there's an idea that I think is, it's not a bad idea, but it's one-sided, and that is you create value for your customers. And people have forgotten that you also have to create value for your suppliers. And that's been a central driver for us at O'Reilly. When we started, we were a book publisher, and we were approached by a startup back in 1999, I think it was, called Books 24/7. And they were going to be a subscription service for ebooks. And they pitched me over dinner, and I kind of did the math for them based on what they were talking about. And I said, you're offering us, the equivalent of 15 cents per book, which we're supposed to share with our authors. I've been working on ebooks for, we were building towards this for many years. And I said, we have to build a model where there's something in it for the people who create the content.
Right.
And so they didn't get it. And so I basically got together with my biggest competitor and said, we need to build a model of an online ebook service. It later became much more than that creates value for the authors so that we can continue to incentivize them to create content. And so I was thinking about that, for our authors. And then, in 2016, when we, the computer book market continued to decline, we eventually became our online program became the biggest source of revenue for our authors. But we felt like we had to do something different. And it was driven by trying to find new revenue for our authors. We came up with this idea of doing live online training as a feature of the platform. And it became, a really big part of our way to keep creating and funding new content. And now I'm really deeply engaged in the question because AI is in many ways it's commoditizing expertise. And so I'm kind of going, okay, well, how do we, I'm not going to go into too many details because I want to roll out some products based on this. But the fundamental driver for me is, okay, in the age of AI, how will we, create new forms that create value for the people who create the content that our customers value? So you have to go upstream and realize you're part of an ecosystem. And, if all you think about is, well, it's us, and then we're trying to create value for customers, and you don't think about your suppliers, you just think about them as somebody to squeeze, you're already in the wrong place. You have to have a much broader sense of value creation.
How do leaders, would you say, then decide when to protect versus give away their IP within what we're discussing here today? Yeah.
I used to have that debate back in the early days of open source, and there were people we did a lot of experimentation with free documentation licenses. And there were authors who basically said, I just want to get this information out, and I'd like to have it be as widely available as possible. And so we used the GNU free documentation license on some of our early Linux books. And the way the market worked, our competitors immediately copied our books, and then there were multiple copies of the same book. None of them sold all that well. And so because of the way the markets work with bookstores, right, nobody knew that they were all the same book. They just said, oh, none of these did that well, right? If they'd added them all up and said these are just 3 editions of the same book, they would have said, oh, actually, that's quite good. But as a result, the books ended up not spreading. And that changed my approach. So now I would say to authors, we can give this stuff away. We can monetize it. Do you want to make the most money? Or, and some people were like, no, I'm only going to do this if it can make a certain amount of money. And so I would just basically, somebody once said to me, actually was talking about, believe it or not, this is in my youth, this guy talking about reincarnation. And I said, well, how does reincarnation, fit with everything we know about genetics? And he said, oh, you picked the hat to fit the head. I always love that idea of where you pick the hat to fit the head. You look, and sometimes, it's like you do whatever it takes. And there's been times when we go, okay, we got to, we want to create as much attention and value, and so you give away as much. And there's a piece I wrote back in 2000 about that was actually put up in just about every bookstore in America. It was called Buy Where You Shop. And it was really about this idea that, like if you, like if you go into a bookstore, it was a open letter to consumers saying, if you go into a bookstore and you like, shopping there, and then if you just do all your browsing there, you've taken a service that is offered as part of an integrated package, and and you're then getting a cheaper price somewhere else that doesn't offer that same experience. So if you want to keep that experience, you need to buy where you shop. And if you book on Amazon and you think that that's the right place to go, then then that's fine. But it's that kind of sense of just, you think through, the connection between what you do and the value. It's just like, in some ways, it's debugging a system and understanding the flow of the end is a way to think about it.
So now, Tim, yourself, you're a leader in open innovation. What advice do you have for brands choosing agency partners who promote open source style models?
I think the first thing is they should be people who help you find your voice and don't substitute for your voice. Now, I've always loved the line from David Ogilvy, who once told a demanding client, don't hire a dog and then bark yourself. Because, agencies can bring a huge amount of value. And if you think about some of the great, events, in advertising and for me in tech, I think about, for example, the Apple 1984 ad or the Think Different. They were created by Chad Day and people there, but they were attuned to, what this sort of unique value that Steve Jobs brought to the vision of how Apple would be somehow different from these other commodity PCs. So they were sort of helping him to amplify his vision. And there's a lot of times where, people just sort of, it's kind of like you're just outsourcing to the agency, and that doesn't work.
And we hear a lot about that, when we come to the specific question, that it's got a lot to do with partnership, not necessarily being a vendor, but being a partner.
That's exactly right. And I think that's true of like PR too. I remember early on, we in my venture career, we were competing. We had one company that was competing with, head to head with, another. And this other company was getting covered in TechCrunch all the time, which is a very popular industry publication at the time. And I called up Mike Arrington at TechCrunch. I said, "How come you always cover mint instead of wasabi?" And he says, "Well, wasabi sends me press releases, and Aaron calls me on the phone. The CEO." It's like he's built a relationship, and so what you want for a PR agency is somebody who figures out who you need to build relationships with and helps you build them, and not somebody who just takes off just manufactures, we're going to post a bunch of stuff to social media for you. We're going to, send out press releases, or we're going to just, get stuff placed. It's really much more like helping the client to build the public profile.
So from a brand's perspective, what would you say are the green and red flags then to watch out for when evaluating agencies that follow open source style models?
Well, I think the biggest thing, is do they come across as having an authentic voice? I think, and again, maybe that's just something I value, but I value that kind of sense of authenticity. And I know there are many, many successful companies that are built not on that basis, that instead create, a fear of missing out or whatever. But I feel like those are all the things that give marketing a bad name. For me, the best marketing is telling us a story that people want to be part of.
Tim, who would you say are the top 3 mentors or peers who have had the biggest impact on your thinking?
Well, I mentioned all of them already. This guy Drew Simon, who really taught me this idea of looking at the world in a fresh way, and gave me that early training in that. And then Brian Kernighan, who crystallized for me this idea of the architecture of participation as being at the heart of Unix, which became Linux. And then Brian Irwin, who kind of taught me this idea about marketing issues and letting your products tag along with them. Actually, Jim Barksdale also had a great line about that. He was the CEO of Netscape in the early days of the web. Yeah, he said, it sounds like what you do is you find a parade and then get in front of it. You correctly identify this thing that's happening and tell the story. Like I was not the mover and shaker of Web 2.0. Or open source, but I became kind of a band leader because I basically brought together the parade, and was able to I did that by showing people who were the true heroes. When I did that open source summit, I didn't say, hey, we're O'Reilly, we do blah blah blah. I put these guys up on the stage in front of a bunch of journalists at the end of the day, and I said, you think free software is this thing that's hostile to, what's the most mission critical program on the internet? What do you use? And I pointed to this guy they never heard of, Paul Vixie. I said, the reason you get to have a URL like NewYorkTimes.com instead of this, I had memorized the IP address, is because of the software that he wrote and runs the domain name system. Or you send an email, it's this guy here, and it was like, by the time I got down to Linus Torvalds, he was like the fifth in the in line, But I was like, these guys have created this, this is this parade. We have a new name for it. It's called open source. So I was, I didn't say anything about O'Reilly's products. Yeah.
Tim, my final question to you is, beyond software, what industries do you think are ripe for disruption through open source principles today?
Well, I guess what I would sort of say is every industry is ripe for disruption. And again, it depends how you think about open source principles. If one part, there's this one part that most people don't focus on, which is commodification, is an inevitable. It creates fertile ground for innovation. When something becomes abundant, something else becomes valuable, right? So, I think that you really have to think about what is becoming abundant and what becomes valuable. And right now, AI is making a certain kind of intelligence and expertise abundant. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is going to be valuable? And I don't know the answer to that yet. It took me, to get from from open source to Web 2.0, took me 6 years of watching and thinking. And I think it's going to be some years before we'll know what the full shape of the AI, value capture is. But there is, going back to Steve Jobs, there is one kind of safe haven throughout all of this, and it's in values. And I learned this from a guy named Dave Hickey, who wrote a wonderful book called Air Guitar, Essays on Art and Democracy. He was an art critic. And he wrote an essay in there called The Birth of the Big Beautiful Art Market. And it was about Harley Earl, who was the VP of marketing at General Motors, who after World War II developed the whole ladder of status. It was like from Chevrolet to Pontiac to Cadillac, and that you had to have the latest model. So they changed the features every year. And that was how they beat Ford in the market. And Dave's description of this was he turned the automobile into an art market. And he defined an art market as a market in which things are sold on the basis of what they mean, not what they do. So now go back to Steve Jobs and, the 1984 ad, the Think Different campaign, and how much that's exactly what he did. He created the Mac as an expression, and the iPhone as an expression, not just of, really an expression of values, where everybody else was sort of creating selling these things on the basis of what they did. He sold them on the basis of what they meant. And I think that that's a safe haven in every cycle of commodification and the search for new sources of unique value. There's that brand value that comes by creating kind of an affiliation with a deep sense of purpose and meaning.
Oh, totally. Tom, thank you so much for joining us on the DesignRush podcast today. I feel like you've given me this masterclass. It's been absolutely amazing. I've enjoyed our conversation. I appreciate your wisdom, and I really appreciate your time as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right.
Curious about what top brands look for when choosing an agency? Tune into our latest episodes where we reveal the decision-making secrets of leading brands. Subscribe to the DesignRush podcast and stay ahead of the competition.